Ellie, you want to jump in and share your presentation?
I do. Okay, here we go. So, everyone, welcome to Showcasing Your Work for Conservation Tech Readers with me, Ellie Warren. I am from Wild Labs. I edit and write much of the stuff that you see on Wild Labs, including Writing Bootcamp, which if you haven't seen, this presentation is basically just a shorter version of that, where you will get much more in-depth information about writing for our audiences. But I thought this would be a fun little way to just review that, because we'd really like to start seeing where people's projects featured on Wild Labs. So why are we doing this? We have a lot of very talented and creative people in the Wild Labs community, but writing is an area that sometimes makes people very nervous, especially if you haven't had a lot of practice in that since you've been in school, or you're mostly used to writing academic publications at this point in your career. But being able to showcase your work through a case study or an article is really, really important. It's a great way to help people connect to your project, and it's a good way to bring attention to your successes. So it's really all about, getting your bragging rights within our community, but also opening yourself up to collaborations and things like that, because you get a lot more eyes on your work. And the good news is, you don't need to be an incredible writer to get that message across. This is more about building your confidence in writing than anything else. All right. A lot of people in our community are also already very skilled at writing academically. I don't know if I'm using that word 100% right. I don't necessarily mean like you're only writing within the confines of an institution. What I mean by that is like you're writing formal research papers for the goal of publishing your work. And not writing a blog post or a case study or an article, which also I will use all three of those interchangeably throughout this. A case study and article, there are some nuanced differences between them, but for the sake of this, they're all articles. They're all ways to just talk about your work. Where was I? Okay, so writing academically doesn't always translate to confidence in writing less formally for a different audience, like you might find on Wild Labs. But luckily, the skills are adaptable. So it's really just a matter of how you approach talking about your project. And with that, we'll get into some of these tips for writing an article that showcases your conservation tech work specifically. Okay, so now in Wild Labs readership, I'm also reading from my phone because my presenter notes weren't showing up on the screen. So if this seems awkward, that's what's happening. It's one of those days on Variety Hour. Now in Wild Labs readership, you will find people with the same expertise as you, and they'll also be very interested in your reports and publications about your work. That's also very important. I'm not saying don't publish those things on Wild Labs, please share them. But the great thing about Wild Labs is that it brings together people from all across the conservation tech field. And that means when you write about your work on the platform, it'll be seen by people of all skill levels. They're working with all types of technology. So you'll also get readers who won't have that same base level of understanding. So if you want to share your work with a broad audience, and especially if you want to collaborate or connect with others through your work, it's really important to tailor your writing in order to connect with a very diverse range of people. Okay, so here you'll see some of the differences between writing for academia or research and writing for the purpose of sharing a project with your audience. So some of those major differences will be in the language. Sometimes your language will be much denser and more technical when you're writing for research purposes. And that's not always necessarily accessible to people who don't already have a base level of expertise in what you're talking about. So if you're writing for a very general audience, you want to make sure that it's simplified a lot more. And while your piece can still be aimed at other experts, I'm not saying you have to write for the general public who has no knowledge about conservation tech. It should ideally be possible for someone who's not an expert. So like think about a student who's going into conservation tech. Should be possible for them to understand the point of your article if they're given the right context. An article will also have a much more narrow focus. And by that, I mean, you don't have to cover everything about your project in an article. You could be focusing on just deployment or on one specific tool or on a particular experience or success you had within a project. You could also be giving an overview of a full project and its outcomes, but in a less formalized way. An important thing to remember is that an article isn't necessarily trying to prove anything about your project. It can just be about showcasing what's interesting or cool, or that you want people to take away from this one thing they're reading about it. So immediately that really takes the pressure off of writing because you don't have to cover everything all at once. All right, so we're gonna get into some very general tips. These are good things to remember no matter what you're writing. Make your writing concise. Now, this is a funny tip coming from me because I never do this. Steph knows I write the longest things in the world, but this isn't necessarily all about length. It's more about just making sure your thoughts are organized in a way that people can follow. And especially if you're new to writing, it can really help if you stick to something like the 5-paragraph structure that everybody hates in school. If you don't know where to start, like that still works. They teach it to you for a reason. It's a really good tool, and then you can expand out from there. Outlining your article is also really important, especially if you're nervous about writing and you don't know where your article is going to go. This will help you figure out those main points that you want to hit. All right, make your writing coherent. Remember that you know the topic you're writing about better than anyone, but that also means you need to take extra care in helping your audience. And what I mean by that is you'll have blind spots about your own work because you understand it so fully. And so you might be taking mental leaps in your writing that you won't recognize, especially if you're reading your article a lot while you're editing it. And a reader can easily get lost if that's the case. So just make sure you're going from point A to point B to point C and not jumping over that middle point, even if it's something that seems super obvious to you. And then, of course, also just look out for basic editing things, grammar issues, typos. It goes without saying, but you'd be surprised how many people can miss things when you've read things a lot of times, including me. And also just look out for ideas that repeat too many times. That's something I see a lot when I'm editing, where I think especially people who are coming from an academic sphere will sort of be like, okay, I have to keep reiterating this one point in every paragraph. You don't. If you've said it really clearly early on, and then you say it really clearly towards the end, if it's something you want to emphasize, that's enough. You don't need to keep circling back to things. Just think of it as a narrative and keep it moving forward. And make your writing catchy. I'm sorry, my notes keep closing on my phone. Make your writing catchy. One of the best tips for this is to read your draft out loud. If you're used to presenting things more than you're used to writing things, I think this is a really helpful tool. Just read it out like dialogue, as though you're speaking it to someone. And if it sounds clunky or confusing or unnatural to say, it'll also sound like that to readers. And also variety hour might be a good example for this. If you think about how you chat about your project in a more casual setting like variety hour, that'll also help you get the right tone for an article or case study that doesn't sound so formal. All right, now these are really fun and really important questions to ask yourself while writing. What is your primary goal for your article? Like I said, you don't have to cover everything all at once in every single article. So try to pick out the main things that you want your audience to take away and think about who that audience is that you're trying to reach. Because whether you're trying to reach experts who already share the same expertise with you, trying to reach potential collaborators, you're trying to reach students who might be interested in a specific tool or learning from your experience, they will take away different things. And so you'll want to make sure that you're hitting on like 2 to 3 main points that those people can focus in on. And now I've circled back to outlining here. And an outline is a great place to start. As I said, I'm sorry, my notes keep closing. This is going great. It's a great tool for collecting your thoughts, but also for seeing where you might be trying to do too much in one article or where your thoughts aren't connecting perfectly. If you can recognize that before you get deep into writing, you'll save yourself so much time. Same thing here, a summary works the same way. If you're used to writing like a thesis statement for something, you'll be used to writing a summary. It's great. If you could easily explain the purpose and the main points of an article to a friend or a peer within a few sentences before you start writing, it's going to turn out so much clearer. You'll save yourself so much stress. So think about if someone had 10 minutes to read and summarize this piece, what would those key takeaways be that they'd focus in on when they're reading your article, and then make sure you're shaping it around that. So outlining is so important that we're going to just keep going with it. So we're going to get into what the structure of Talia, could I get a check on the time? How am I doing?
Yeah, we should wrap up pretty quickly. We got to move.
Okay, we're gonna move so fast through these, you guys. All of this information is available in Writing Bootcamp, so don't worry if we go through this fast. You can get it all on Wild Labs. So your intro paragraph, you're giving people a quick overview. You want to keep it short and snappy. Mention things like the technology you're using, species, habitat, etc., etc. Context paragraphs. These are more important to go a little more in depth on, because this is the area that will help your readers who don't have that same base level of expertise find it accessible, find it understandable as they continue on. You want to simplify your jargon here, keep everything as base level as you can. That doesn't mean to dumb things down. It just means that, you know, think about if you were starting out on your career path, would you be able to understand this, or is it a little too high level for someone to catch up on? If you're giving context, you want to make sure that that's sort of their base camp for building the understanding they need throughout the rest of the article. Main paragraphs. And this is where you want to hit those main points that we talked about in your outline. So the things that you want people to take away. The most important thing to remember here is that your article is a narrative story. So every paragraph is moving your story along. It's not just reiterating what we already know, and it's not just giving dry facts. I think that makes things a little more fun. Okay, this is stuff that we've already kind of talked about, so we can move along, but just remember that readers who want to know more information about your project, they can always seek that out. So again, don't feel like you have to cover everything. Conclusion. This is the place where you want to reiterate why your work is important. You briefly capture your main points again. Doesn't mean repeating exactly what you've already said. So I like to think of this as a place to make a final point about why readers should care instead of just doing another summary. And a good question to ask for this is there anything important that you haven't said about why you're sharing this work in particular, or from this angle in particular? And for busy readers who skim your article, this might be the only part that they really focus in on to see if they've missed any key thoughts that they want to circle back to and reread. And for those who read your entire article, this is a good place for them to collect their own thoughts and think about how they might want to engage with your project if that's something you want them to do. And finally, the call to action. This is where you might want to start a discussion about a topic. You might want to find collaborators, or if it's just bringing more eyes to your project and sending people to a link that is a more in-depth research paper or something, this is where you want to do that. So there are some examples of calls to action you could do at the end of your article. Final thoughts. Anyone can write. It's a lot like Ratatouille. Anyone can cook. Anyone can write. You don't have to be great at this. You just need to be confident enough to communicate it clearly, show people why your work is important and cool. And if you can get your thoughts across in a really clear way that makes people understand that, that's always more important than writing with style. So if your big stumbling block is that you think your writing is a little boring, or it's a little clunky, or you know, maybe it's not as slick as you might see in a magazine or something, it really doesn't matter. The majority of people in the world are not great writers, but they still have things that they should be able to share with the world. So just practice. And writing for Wild Labs is also a low pressure way to build this skill, because you're writing for an audience that already cares about your work. So that should make you feel really good. If you are interested in learning more about writing for Wild Labs and building your skills, you can explore our writing bootcamp. There is the link. There are 3 articles that you can find on Wild Labs right now that talk through everything I've covered in a lot more depth. And if you're ready to share your writing on Wild Labs, you can head to wildlabs.net/resources to get started. And I hope to see many of your projects on Wild Labs soon. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellie. That was wonderful. So yeah, just as Ellie said, the reason we included this in Variety Hours is because we have so many cool projects come here every month, and it's really important to communicate those and get them captured and out into the world. And Ellie has been a super valuable part of our team, helping that content get out into the community. Steph just shared a recent series that we published, and also Ellie's bootcamp is linked in the chat. Ellie, you got a bunch of interesting comments and questions in there that you can follow up with too. So thank you. And yes, please go share your work on Wild Labs and elsewhere, and use Ellie's top tips to do so effectively.